When I came into a massive $553 million inheritance, I decided to keep it a secret from everyone, especially my son's new wife. I had a bad feeling about her from the start and was convinced she was just a gold digger. I pretended to be just getting by, waiting for her to show her greedy side. It didn't take long. Just days after the wedding, she showed up at my front porch with a sharp-looking lawyer standing behind her. I thought she found out about my money, but the document she handed me was the last thing I expected. The sun had barely risen when Richard Thompson sat down at his scratched oak table. In his hands, he held a piece of mail that he had already read a dozen times. The logo of the National Lottery Commission was stamped clearly in the top corner. He took a sip of his lukewarm coffee and looked at the numbers again. It still felt like a mistake, but the official seal and the signature at the bottom said otherwise. The text on the page was unambiguous about the transfer of funds. It stated clearly that the full amount of $553 million had been deposited into his checking account that morning. Richard pulled out his phone and opened his banking app to verify the claim. The screen loaded slowly, but finally, the balance appeared in bold black digits. He had never seen so many zeros in one place in his entire life. Privacy was now his top priority before anyone else found out about his new status. He dialed the number for his attorney, a man he had trusted for decades. Richard gave strict instructions to lock down the account and seal the records immediately. He did not want neighbors or distant relatives coming out of the woodwork looking for handouts. The lawyer agreed to set up a blind trust to keep his name off the public registry. Richard walked to his closet and pushed aside the few nice shirts he owned. He reached for a faded denim jacket with frayed cuffs and a tear near the pocket. It smelled of old oil and stale tobacco, which was perfect for the image he needed to project. He checked himself in the mirror to make sure he looked sufficiently downtrodden. Satisfied with his appearance, he grabbed his keys and headed out the door to see his son. The engine of his pickup truck sputtered and coughed as he drove through the suburban streets. Instead of pulling into the driveway, Richard stopped the vehicle 2 blocks away from Mark's house. He wanted to make sure that anyone watching saw him walking the rest of the way. It was a calculated move to reinforce the idea that he was struggling to keep gas in the tank. He walked slowly toward the house, keeping his head down. Mark was waiting inside the local diner with a woman Richard had only seen in photos. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as they slid into a vinyl booth near the back. Mark smiled nervously and introduced Alina, placing his hand gently on her back. She wore a simple dress, but her eyes scanned Richard with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. He shook her hand, noting that her grip was firm and her expression unreadable. The waitress brought their menus, but Alina seemed more interested in conversation than food. She leaned across the sticky table and began probing into Richard's past. Her questions were specific, focusing on property ownership and old family investments. Richard felt his guard go up immediately as he realized she was digging for information. He took a long sip of water to buy himself time before answering her intrusive inquiries about his assets. Richard shook his head and let out a heavy sigh to derail her line of questioning. He started talking about how hard it was just to afford milk and bread these days. He mentioned that his pension barely covered the electric bill during the winter months. Alina watched him without blinking, her face remaining perfectly neutral. He hoped his complaints about inflation and poverty would convince her that there was nothing worth taking from him. A few months later, the couple exchanged vows in Mark's overgrown backyard. Folding chairs were set up on the uneven grass for the dozen guests in attendance. There were no fancy flower arrangements or expensive catering trucks in sight. It was a budget affair that fit perfectly with Richard's narrative of financial hardship. He stood near the back, watching the ceremony while keeping a close eye on the bride. The reception was just a potluck on picnic tables, but Richard noticed Alina watching him again. She leaned in close to Mark and whispered something into his ear. Her eyes flicked down toward Richard's scuffed shoes and his ill-fitting, thrift store suit. Mark looked over at his father with a pained expression but didn't say anything. Richard felt a surge of anger, assuming she was criticizing his lack of contribution to their special day. The quiet of Richard's morning was broken by the sound of a powerful engine outside. He moved to the window and saw a shiny black luxury car navigating the potholes of his street. It looked completely out of place against the backdrop of his peeling paint and overgrown lawn. The vehicle came to a smooth stop right in front of his house. Richard felt his heart rate increase as the driver turned off the ignition. He peeked through the dusty slats of his blinds to identify the visitors. The passenger door opened, and Alina stepped out onto the cracked pavement. She looked entirely different from the woman in the simple dress at the diner. Today she wore a tailored power suit and expensive sunglasses. Richard stepped back from the window, realizing that his charade might be over. She walked toward his porch with a confident stride. Alina was not alone on this unexpected visit to his humble home. A tall man emerged from the driver's side, buttoning a charcoal suit jacket. He carried a thick leather briefcase that looked like it cost more than Richard's truck. The man fell into step behind Alina, acting like a bodyguard or a high-priced advisor. Richard clenched his jaw, knowing that people like that only showed up when money was involved. The knock on the door was sharp and authoritative. Richard took a deep breath, bracing himself for the confrontation he had feared since the lottery win. He was certain that Alina had dug up the truth about his bank account. The presence of the attorney made it clear that she wasn't here for a friendly chat. She was likely here to demand a payout or threaten a lawsuit for a share of the fortune. Richard unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open just enough to see them. He blocked the entrance with his body, keeping one hand gripped tightly on the doorframe. He did not invite them in or offer a greeting. He just stared at Alina, waiting for her to make the first move. She looked at him with a serious expression and asked if they could come inside to discuss an urgent matter. Reluctantly, Richard stepped aside and allowed the pair to enter his living room. The lawyer walked straight to the center of the room and set the briefcase down. It landed with a heavy thud on the scarred wood of the coffee table. The man did not speak or offer a handshake. He simply stood at attention next to the table, waiting for further instructions. The tension in the small room was thick enough to cut. Alina took a seat on the sagging sofa, smoothing her skirt as she sat. Richard remained standing, crossing his arms over his chest defensively. She looked up at him and then nodded subtly to the man standing beside the table. The lawyer reached down and flipped the brass latches on the case with a loud click. Richard watched their synchronized movements, feeling like he was the target of a well-rehearsed operation. The silence stretched on for a moment too long as the case opened. Richard prepared his refusal speech in his head. He was ready to tell them to get off his property and that they wouldn't see a dime. He glared at Alina, expecting her to start listing numbers or making threats about entitlement. He was sure she was about to reveal her true colors as a greedy manipulator. The lawyer reached into the velvet-lined interior of the briefcase. He withdrew a thick stack of papers bound together with a heavy clip. The documents looked official, stamped with seals and printed on high-quality bond paper. He handled them with extreme care, as if they were fragile. Richard squinted at the text on the front page, but he was too far away to read the fine print. With a fluid motion, the attorney pushed the stack across the table's surface. The papers stopped right at the edge, directly in front of where Richard stood. Alina gestured for him to pick them up and read them. She remained silent, her eyes fixed on his face to gauge his reaction. Richard hesitated for a second before reaching out. He grabbed the document, steeling himself for the bad news. His hands shook slightly as he lifted the heavy paperwork closer to his eyes. The legal jargon was dense, but the header at the top was clear enough. He read the first few lines, his mind racing to process the words. He expected to see a lawsuit or a demand letter for alimony or support, but as he read further, the words on the page didn't match his angry assumptions. The document was a prenuptial agreement, but not the kind he had imagined. It listed assets that went far beyond his own recent lottery winnings. The paper detailed a family trust, real estate holdings, and tech stocks valued in the billions. Alina was not chasing his money. She was the sole heiress to a massive industrial fortune. Richard stared at the numbers, realizing she was wealthier than he could have ever guessed. He flipped to the next page, which outlined the terms of the agreement. It stated explicitly that all her assets would remain separate from Mark and his family. She wasn't trying to take anything from Richard. She was ensuring he couldn't take anything from her. The whispers about his clothes and the questions about his finances suddenly made sense. She was worried that he was the one who might be a gold digger. The tension in the room evaporated in an instant. Richard lowered the papers and looked at his new daughter-in-law with fresh eyes. She wasn't a predator, she was just being as cautious as he was. Alina offered him a warm, knowing smile. She explained that she wanted to make sure Mark loved her for who she was, not her money. It was the exact same game Richard had been playing. A laugh bubbled up from Richard's chest as the absurdity of the situation hit him. He had spent months hiding his millions from a billionaire who was hiding her billions from him. He took the pen from the lawyer and signed the witness line with a flourish. They were two of a kind, protecting their secrets to find the truth. Now they could finally stop pretending and just be a family.